I'll give you 5 sons before winter, the giant rancher promised the barren widow. The autumn wind carried whispers of judgment through Millbrook Valley, where children were seen as blessings and their absence as divine punishment. Margaret Thornfield had learned to walk with her head high despite the stares, despite the crossed fingers and muttered prayers that followed her through the dusty streets. The curse of the childless woman had marked her for 3 long years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Dakota Territory stretched endlessly beyond Millbrook Valley, where wheat fields rolled like golden waves toward distant horizons. Margaret Thornfield stood at her kitchen window, watching the morning mist rise from Mill Creek. Her small homestead cabin felt too quiet, too empty for a woman who had once filled it with dreams of laughter and tiny footsteps. 3 years had passed since cholera claimed her husband Thomas, leaving behind debts, whispered blame, and a womb that remained stubbornly empty despite 2 brief marriages since. The townspeople of Millbrook had decided Margaret's childlessness was proof of moral failing. Wives pulled their young ones closer when she passed. Mothers blessed themselves and spoke of divine judgment. Even the chickens seemed to lay fewer eggs when she tended them, or so claimed Mrs. Ashbrook from the general store. The weight of their judgment pressed against Margaret's shoulders like stones in a heavy sack. She had married Thomas Thornfield at 17, full of hope and plans for a house filled with children. When months passed without the expected blessing, the town's concern gradually shifted to suspicion. When Thomas died of fever, leaving her to face his creditors alone, suspicion hardened into certainty. A woman who could not bear children was somehow fundamentally broken, marked by heaven's displeasure. Her second marriage to Samuel Fletcher had lasted 8 months. He was a kind man who promised patience, who swore the town's gossip meant nothing to him. But when their union remained childless and his crops failed 2 seasons running, even Samuel began to wonder if the whispers held truth. He left quietly one morning, heading west with a wagon train bound for Oregon, taking nothing but his clothes and leaving behind a note that spoke of fresh starts and new opportunities. Her third marriage to Henry Walsh had been purely practical. He needed someone to tend his ailing mother. She needed respectability and protection from creditors. Neither expected love, but both hoped for children who might silence the town's cruel tongues. When Henry's mother passed after 6 months and still no baby quickened in Margaret's womb, Henry took to drinking at the saloon and speaking loudly about women who brought curses to honest men. That marriage ended when Henry fell from his horse while drunk, breaking his neck on the rocks by Miller's Bend. Now Margaret faced her 4th winter alone, with mortgage payments due and neighbors who crossed themselves when she walked past. The bank threatened foreclosure. The church ladies whispered about divine retribution. Even Dr. Hartwell, who had delivered half the babies in Millbrook Valley, looked at her with poorly concealed pity and spoke vaguely about women whose constitutions were not suited for motherhood. The sound of hoofbeats on the dirt road made Margaret look up from her washing. A shadow fell across her yard as a horse and rider approached the wooden gate that marked her property line. The horse seemed almost comically small beneath its rider, a man whose massive frame made even the sturdy gelding appear delicate. Silas Moreland owned the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties, but his visits to town were rare enough that many residents had never seen him up close. Margaret had heard the stories about Silas Moreland, how he had arrived in Dakota Territory 5 years earlier with nothing but a weathered saddle and enough gold to purchase land that other men could only dream of owning. How he could gentle the wildest Mustang with whispered words and patient hands. How his cattle thrived when other ranchers lost stock to harsh winters and disease. Some claimed he had supernatural skills with animals. Others whispered that his wealth came from less legitimate sources. What struck Margaret most was his stillness. Despite his enormous size, Silas moved with careful deliberation, as though he understood that his presence could overwhelm others. He dismounted with fluid grace, removed his hat in a gesture of respect, and approached her gate with measured steps. His weathered face bore the lines of someone who spent long hours under open sky, but his eyes held intelligence and something else. Kindness perhaps, or understanding born from experience with judgment. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said, his voice carrying the soft rumble of distant thunder. "I've come to discuss a proposition that might benefit us both." Margaret dried her hands on her apron, studying this unexpected visitor. Silas Moreland was everything the stories claimed. Tall enough to block the morning sun, broad enough to shelter a person from prairie wind, yet gentle in his approach. His clothes were well made but practical, the clothing of a man who worked his own land despite his wealth. His boots showed honest wear, his hands, though large enough to span a dinner plate, held his hat like it might break. "I'm afraid I have little to offer in the way of business arrangements, Mr. Moreland," Margaret replied. Her voice carried the weariness of someone who had grown accustomed to disappointment. "The bank owns more of this property than I do." Silas's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. A relaxation perhaps, as though her honesty had confirmed something he already suspected. "Ma'am, I've heard the talk in town, about your circumstances. About the blame folks place on your shoulders for things no person should have to carry." Margaret's cheeks flushed with embarrassment and anger. Even this powerful rancher had heard the whispers about her barrenness, her supposed curse. She straightened her spine, preparing for another lecture about accepting God's will or suggestions that she consider leaving Millbrook Valley for everyone's benefit. "What you've heard is between me and the almighty Mr. Moreland. I don't see how it concerns your cattle business." To her surprise, Silas smiled. It transformed his weathered features, revealing warmth that the town's gossips had never met. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mentioned in their stories about the mysterious rancher. "Mrs. Thornfield, I've learned that town talk usually has about as much truth as a politician's promise. I prefer to judge matters for myself." He gestured toward her small garden, where neat rows of vegetables grew despite the challenging soil. "Anyone who can coax crops from this hard-pan dirt has skills that go beyond what most folks possess. Anyone who maintains a homestead alone, while facing the kind of pressure you've endured, has strength that commands respect." Margaret found herself studying Silas Moreland with new attention. Most men who spoke to her these days wanted something. Money she didn't have, land she barely owned, or simply the satisfaction of telling her exactly what they thought of women who couldn't fulfill their basic purpose. This man seemed different. His compliments felt genuine rather than calculated. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Moreland?" Silas replaced his hat and looked toward the horizon where his vast ranch stretched beyond sight. "I have 5,000 head of cattle, more land than 10 men could properly manage, and a house that echoes with emptiness. What I don't have is family. What I don't have is someone to share the work and the rewards of building something lasting." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Another marriage proposal. She had sworn after Henry's death that she would never again tie her future to a man's changing moods and uncertain promises. Too many times she had believed that this husband would be different, that this time she would find acceptance and perhaps even love. Too many times she had been proven wrong. "Mr. Moreland, I think you should know that I am not capable of providing what most men expect from marriage. The town has made its opinion quite clear on that subject." Silas turned his full attention back to her, and Margaret saw something unexpected in his expression. Not pity or disappointment, but understanding. As though he recognized something in her situation that others had missed. "Mrs. Thornfield, I've spent considerable time observing this town and its people. I've noticed that folks here have strong opinions about many things they don't actually understand. They've decided you're barren because you haven't borne children. They've decided you're cursed because misfortune has touched your life. They've decided these things because it's easier than examining their own failures and shortcomings." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had learned long ago that crying only gave her enemies more ammunition. "Those are kind words, Mr. Moreland, but kindness doesn't change facts. 3 marriages, no children. The evidence speaks for itself." "Does it?" Silas asked quietly. "Or does the evidence speak to something else entirely?" Before Margaret could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Reverend Jeremiah Blackwell rode toward the homestead with his usual entourage of devoted followers. The Reverend's black gelding pranced beneath him as though it sensed its rider's self-importance. Behind him rode Mayor Whitmore, Sheriff Vale, and banker Harold Grimsby. An impressive show of authority for what should have been a simple social call. Margaret's stomach tightened with familiar dread. Visits from Reverend Blackwell rarely brought good news. The man had made his opinion of her quite clear from the pulpit, speaking often about the consequences of sin and the way God's displeasure manifested in earthly failures. He had never directly named her from the pulpit, but his pointed glances and carefully chosen examples left no doubt about his intended target. Silas Moreland stepped closer to Margaret, not quite positioning himself between her and the approaching riders, but making his protective presence unmistakable. His massive frame cast a longer shadow as the morning sun climbed higher behind the hills. The gesture was subtle but clear. Margaret was not facing this delegation alone. Reverend Blackwell's pale eyes fixed on Silas with the look of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any gathering. His black coat hung perfectly pressed, despite the dusty ride. His white collar gleamed like a badge of moral authority. Everything about his appearance was calculated to remind others of his position as spiritual leader of Millbrook Valley. "Mr. Moreland," the Reverend said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone comfortable with public speaking. "How unexpected to find you here. I trust you're not being influenced by unfortunate circumstances to make hasty decisions." Silas's voice remained calm, but Margaret detected steel beneath the gentle tone. "Reverend Blackwell, I'm conducting private business on private property. Nothing hasty about careful consideration." The mayor shifted in his saddle, his round face flushed with the effort of the morning ride. Mayor Whitmore was a man who preferred the comfort of his office to the challenges of actual leadership. But Reverend Blackwell's influence often compelled him to venture forth on missions he would rather avoid. "Moreland, we're all friends here," Mayor Whitmore said, attempting a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We're simply concerned about the welfare of our community members. Sometimes folks need guidance to avoid making choices they might later regret." Sheriff Vale remained silent, but his hand rested casually near his weapon. Duncan Vale was Blackwell's man through and through, more interested in enforcing the Reverend's moral vision than maintaining actual law and order. His presence at this gathering spoke to the seriousness with which the town's leadership viewed Silas's visit to Margaret's homestead. Banker Grimsby cleared his throat with the self-importance of a man who controlled other people's financial futures. "Mrs. Thornfield, I believe you received my recent correspondence regarding your mortgage obligations. Perhaps this would be an appropriate time to discuss realistic solutions to your situation." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. The humiliation of having her private financial struggles discussed in front of witnesses was precisely the kind of public shaming these men specialized in delivering. They wanted her to feel small, powerless, dependent on their mercy for survival. "My business arrangements are exactly that, Mr. Grimsby. My business." Reverend Blackwell's thin lips curved into what might charitably be called a smile. "Mrs. Thornfield, pride has always been your greatest weakness. The Lord works through earthly authorities to guide his children toward righteousness. Perhaps he is using your current difficulties to encourage humility and acceptance of his will." Silas stepped forward slightly, his movement casual but unmistakable. "Reverend, seems to me the Lord might work through many different channels, including respect for folks trying to handle their affairs with dignity." The Reverend's eyes sharpened with interest. Here was potential opposition to his authority, something he had rarely encountered in Millbrook Valley. Most residents found it easier to defer to his judgment than face the social consequences of disagreement. "Mr. Moreland, as a newcomer to our community, you may not fully understand the complexities of this situation. Mrs. Thornfield has faced considerable tragedy in her life. 3 husbands claimed by untimely death. No children despite multiple marriages. These patterns suggest divine displeasure that extends beyond personal misfortune." Margaret had heard these accusations countless times, but they still stung like fresh wounds. The implication that she was somehow responsible for her husband's deaths, that her barrenness was evidence of moral failing, that God himself had marked her as unworthy of normal happiness. Patterns, Silas observed thoughtfully, can suggest many different things depending on how you examine them. Sometimes what looks like divine displeasure is actually human interference disguised as God's will. The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Reverend Blackwell's face flushed with anger at the implied challenge to his spiritual authority. Mayor Whitmore looked confused, as though he couldn't quite follow the conversation's direction. Sheriff Vale's hand moved closer to his weapon. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Moreland," the Reverend said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Are you suggesting that faithful Christians are somehow responsible for the misfortunes that naturally follow sin and moral failing?" "I'm suggesting that faithful Christians might want to examine their own actions before declaring others cursed by heaven." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring between the two men. Margaret found herself holding her breath, amazed that anyone had finally spoken the thoughts she had carried alone for 3 years. Someone was actually questioning the town's accepted narrative about her supposed guilt and divine punishment. Banker Grimsby attempted to defuse the situation by returning to practical matters. Regardless of philosophical differences, Mrs. Thornfield's mortgage remains in arrears. The bank cannot indefinitely extend credit based on sentiment rather than collateral. "What's the amount?" Silas asked quietly. Grimsby blinked in surprise. "I beg your pardon. The total amount owed. What would it take to satisfy the debt completely?" Margaret stared at Silas in shock. No one had ever offered to help with her financial obligations. Most people seemed to view her struggles as appropriate consequences for her moral failings. The idea that this powerful rancher might actually intervene on her behalf was almost too unexpected to process. "Mr. Moreland," she said quickly, "I cannot accept charity. I've always paid my own way." "Wouldn't be charity, Mrs. Thornfield. Would be investment in a partnership I believe could benefit us both." Reverend Blackwell's eyes narrowed with suspicion and growing anger. "Mr. Moreland, I strongly advise against any hasty commitments involving Mrs. Thornfield. Her history speaks for itself. Men who become entangled in her affairs tend to meet unfortunate ends." The accusation was more direct than the Reverend usually risked, but Margaret's potential escape from his influence seemed to be driving him toward desperation. If she gained the protection of Silas Moreland's wealth and status, she would no longer be vulnerable to the kinds of pressure the town's leadership specialized in applying. Margaret felt the familiar surge of anger at hearing herself blamed for deaths that had been caused by disease, accident, and poor choices. But this time, she was not facing the accusations alone. Silas Moreland's presence beside her felt like a shield against the storm of judgment and condemnation. "Reverend," Silas said, his voice carrying quiet authority that seemed to fill the space around them, "I've heard a lot of talk since arriving in Millbrook Valley. Talk about curses and divine punishment. Talk about women who bring misfortune to honest men. But I've also noticed something interesting about this talk." He paused, allowing his words to settle over the gathered men like dust after a windstorm. "The folks doing most of the talking seem to benefit considerably from keeping certain people feeling small and powerless. Makes a man wonder what they're afraid might happen if those people started standing tall." The implication hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge. Reverend Blackwell's face darkened with rage at having his motives questioned so directly. Mayor Whitmore shifted nervously in his saddle. Sheriff Vale's jaw tightened with the look of a man considering whether this conversation had crossed the line into actionable offense. "This conversation is over," Reverend Blackwell declared, wheeling his horse around with violent precision. "Mr. Moreland, you would do well to remember that this community takes care of its own problems in its own way. Interference from outsiders is neither needed nor appreciated." As the delegation rode away, their horses' hooves raising clouds of dust that obscured their retreat, Margaret found herself alone with Silas Moreland in a silence that felt different from the emptiness she had grown accustomed to. This silence felt full of possibility rather than void of hope. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did." Silas's response was immediate and certain. "Mrs. Thornfield, I've seen what happens when good people stay silent while others suffer injustice. I've learned that sometimes standing up is the only choice that lets a man sleep peacefully at night." Margaret studied his weathered features, searching for signs of the calculation or hidden agenda she had learned to expect from men who offered help. Instead, she saw something that had been absent from her life for longer than she cared to remember. She saw genuine respect, offered freely without conditions or expectations of gratitude. The Reverend meant what he said about this community taking care of its own problems. "You may have just made yourself a target for their attention." Silas smiled, and Margaret felt something flutter in her chest that she had thought was dead forever. Hope, perhaps, or simply the relief of not facing her struggles alone. "Mrs. Thornfield, I didn't build the largest ranch in 3 counties by backing down from men who mistake fear for respect. If Reverend Blackwell wants to make this about more than your right to live peacefully on your own land, he'll discover that some targets shoot back." The promise in his words felt as solid as the ground beneath her feet. For the first time in 3 years, Margaret allowed herself to believe that winter might not bring the foreclosure notice she had been dreading. That spring might actually come again, bringing with it possibilities she had stopped allowing herself to imagine. "I'll give you 5 sons before winter," Silas had said. And though Margaret didn't yet understand how such a promise could be fulfilled, she found herself beginning to believe that Silas Moreland was a man who kept his word. Margaret Thornfield had learned to navigate the streets of Millbrook Valley like a ship threading dangerous waters. She knew which shopkeepers would serve her without comment and which would find excuses to close early when they spotted her approaching. She understood the rhythm of whispered conversations that ceased when she entered a room, only to resume with increased intensity after she passed. 3 years of widowhood had taught her to read the subtle signs of rejection and judgment that governed her daily existence. The morning after Silas Moreland's visit, Margaret made her weekly trip to town for supplies. She carried herself with the same quiet dignity that had sustained her through countless similar journeys. But something had shifted in her bearing. The rancher's words about town talk having as much truth as a politician's promise echoed in her mind, providing a different lens through which to view the stares and whispers that accompanied her movements. Mrs. Ruth Ashbrook operated the general store with the efficiency of someone who viewed commerce as a moral obligation rather than a pleasure. Her gray hair was pulled back so severely that it seemed to stretch the disapproval permanently into her features. She had served Margaret for 3 years without once offering a greeting beyond the bare minimum required for business transactions. Today proved no different. Margaret placed her coins on the wooden counter and waited while Mrs. Ashbrook gathered the requested items: flour, sugar, coffee beans, a small piece of salt pork. Supplies chosen for their ability to stretch across many meals rather than their appeal to the palate. The storekeeper's movements were sharp and efficient, motivated by a desire to complete the transaction as quickly as possible. "Heard you had a visitor yesterday," Mrs. Ashbrook said without looking up from her counting. The comment was delivered with the casual tone of someone discussing weather, but Margaret recognized the probing nature of the inquiry. News traveled faster than prairie fire in Millbrook Valley, especially news involving the town's most notorious resident. "I did," Margaret replied evenly. She had learned that offering minimal information often satisfied curiosity better than defensive explanations that only invited further questions. Mrs. Ashbrook's hands paused in their wrapping of the salt pork, her pale eyes fixed on Margaret with the intensity of someone who had been elected spokesperson for collective community concern. "Mr. Moreland's a powerful man. Wealthy, influential. Some might say it's presumptuous for certain folks to expect his attention." The criticism was delivered with surgical precision, designed to wound while maintaining plausible deniability. Margaret had endured similar attacks countless times, but today the words seemed to bounce off her like raindrops on oiled leather. Silas Moreland's promise to judge matters for himself had somehow created a protective barrier around her sense of self-worth. "Some might say a lot of things," Margaret responded calmly. "Doesn't make them true or worth repeating." Mrs. Ashbrook's eyebrows rose in surprise. The barren widow's responses were usually apologetic deflections rather than quiet challenges to community wisdom. This unexpected assertiveness suggested influences that Mrs. Ashbrook found deeply troubling. "Pride comes before a fall, Margaret Thornfield. You do well to remember that some men promise things they have no intention of delivering, especially to women who've already proven themselves poor judges of character." The reference to Margaret's deceased husbands hung in the air like smoke from a badly tended fire. It was a cruel reminder wrapped in the language of helpful concern, the kind of emotional manipulation that had worn down Margaret's resistance over months of similar encounters. But today something was different. Instead of feeling the familiar stab of shame and self-doubt, Margaret found herself analyzing Mrs. Ashbrook's words with new clarity. The storekeeper's criticism seemed less like moral guidance and more like the desperate attempt of someone protecting a narrative that served her own sense of superiority. "Mrs. Ashbrook, I've always paid for my purchases in full and on time. My personal affairs are exactly that. Personal." Margaret gathered her wrapped supplies with movements that suggested the conversation was concluded. "I believe that concludes our business for today." The dismissal was polite but firm, leaving Mrs. Ashbrook standing behind her counter with her mouth slightly open in surprise. The barren widow had just ended a conversation rather than enduring whatever additional criticism might have been forthcoming. Such assertiveness was unprecedented and deeply unsettling. Margaret's next stop was Dr. Hartwell's office, where she hoped to purchase laudanum for the headaches that had plagued her since Henry Walsh's death. William Hartwell had attended all three of her husbands during their final illnesses, and his demeanor toward her had grown increasingly cold with each unsuccessful attempt to save them. He seemed to view her presence as a harbinger of medical failure. Dr. Hartwell's office occupied the second floor of the town's largest building, above the lawyer's practice and the land office. The waiting room was small and cramped, with wooden chairs that had been arranged to discourage lingering. Medical texts lined the shelves, their leather bindings speaking to the doctor's educational credentials and professional authority. Dr. Hartwell emerged from his examining room with the brisk efficiency of a man who preferred to keep appointments brief and impersonal. He was younger than Margaret had expected when she first met him, perhaps 40 years old, with the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors. His hands were soft and clean, unmarked by physical labor, and he carried himself with the careful posture of someone conscious of his professional dignity. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said, consulting a pocket watch with theatrical precision. "I have a few minutes available. What seems to be the difficulty today?" Margaret had rehearsed her request during the walk from the general store, choosing words that would minimize the doctor's opportunities for moral commentary. "I'm experiencing frequent headaches, Dr. Hartwell. I was hoping you might have something that could provide relief." Dr. Hartwell's pale eyes studied her with the clinical detachment of someone examining a particularly interesting specimen. His gaze lingered on her face, noting the fine lines around her eyes and the tension in her jaw that spoke to chronic stress. He made notes on a small pad with careful penmanship. "Headaches can have many causes, Mrs. Thornfield. Physical ailments often reflect spiritual or moral distress. Have you considered that your discomfort might be symptomatic of deeper issues requiring attention?" The suggestion was delivered with professional concern, but Margaret recognized the underlying implication. Dr. Hartwell was suggesting that her headaches were punishment for moral failings rather than medical symptoms requiring treatment. It was a diagnosis that conveniently absolved him of any obligation to provide effective care. "Doctor, I'm seeking relief from pain, not spiritual counseling. Do you have laudanum available for purchase or not? Dr. Hartwell's eyebrows rose at her directness. Like Mrs. Ashbrook, he seemed surprised by Margaret's unwillingness to accept moral instruction disguised as professional advice. The barren widow was displaying an independence of thought that challenged his authority as both medical practitioner and moral advisor. Mrs. Thornfield, laudanum is a powerful medication that requires careful supervision. Given your history of personal difficulties, I'm not certain that introducing such substances into your daily routine would be advisable. Margaret felt anger building in her chest like steam in a kettle. Dr. Hartwell was denying her medical treatment based on moral judgments rather than medical assessment. He was using his professional authority to punish her for the crime of being unable to bear children and unfortunate enough to lose multiple husbands. Dr. Hartwell, I'm a grown woman with the resources to pay for medication. My personal history has no bearing on my ability to responsibly manage pain relief. Doesn't it? Dr. Hartwell set down his pen and fixed her with a stare that seemed designed to make her feel small and foolish. Mrs. Thornfield, you've been married 3 times to men who died under unusual circumstances. You've failed to produce children despite multiple opportunities. These patterns suggest underlying issues that go beyond simple medical complaints. The accusation was more direct than the doctor usually risked, but Margaret's growing assertiveness seemed to be provoking increasingly desperate attempts to restore the established power dynamic. Dr. Hartwell needed her to remain submissive and apologetic, accepting his moral authority without question. Instead, Margaret straightened her spine and met his stare with steady composure. Doctor, are you suggesting that I was somehow responsible for my husband's deaths? That cholera, snakebite, and accidental injury were caused by my presence rather than by disease and misfortune? Dr. Hartwell's face flushed with embarrassment at having his implications stated so directly. He had grown comfortable delivering veiled accusations that allowed him to maintain professional dignity while making his moral judgments clear. Being forced to defend his position explicitly was uncomfortable and potentially damaging to his reputation. I'm suggesting that some people seem to attract tragedy in ways that defy normal explanation. As a medical professional, I have an obligation to consider all factors when prescribing treatments that could potentially be harmful. Margaret gathered her shawl around her shoulders with movements that suggested the appointment was concluded. Dr. Hartwell, I believe I'll seek medical care from someone who bases treatment decisions on symptoms rather than superstition. Good day. The dismissal left Dr. Hartwell standing in his office with his mouth open in surprise. The barren widow had just questioned his professional judgment and walked away from his authority. Such defiance was unprecedented and deeply troubling. Margaret's transformation continued as she made her way through the town square toward Mill Creek Bridge. The morning's encounters had revealed something important about the nature of the judgment she had endured for 3 years. The criticism and condemnation were not inevitable consequences of her circumstances. They were choices made by people who benefited from keeping her feeling powerless and ashamed. The bridge spanning Mill Creek was a favorite gathering place for the town's women, who came to wash clothes and exchange gossip while their children played in the shallow water. Margaret usually avoided the bridge during busy hours, but today she felt drawn to test her newfound sense of independence against the collective judgment of Millbrook Valley's moral authorities. Miss Elizabeth Porter stood among a group of mothers, supervising their children while contributing to a conversation that seemed particularly animated. Miss Porter served as the town's school teacher, a position that granted her considerable influence over community standards and expectations. She was unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, having dedicated herself to education with the fervor of someone who viewed learning as moral obligation. The conversation ceased abruptly when Margaret appeared on the bridge. The women's faces turned toward her with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Their children continued playing in the water, blissfully unaware of the adult tensions swirling around them like invisible currents. Mrs. Thornfield, Miss Porter said with the carefully controlled voice of someone addressing a potential source of contamination. How unexpected to see you here during the social hour. The greeting was delivered with professional politeness, but the underlying message was clear. Margaret's presence was unwelcome during times when respectable women gathered for fellowship and mutual support. She was expected to conduct her business during off hours when her moral failings would not influence impressionable minds. Miss Porter, ladies. Margaret nodded toward the group with calm courtesy. Beautiful morning for outdoor activities. The comment was innocuous enough, but several of the women exchanged glances that suggested Margaret's mere presence was somehow inappropriate. They seemed to view her as a moral contaminant whose proximity might somehow affect their own standing in the community. Mrs. Crenshaw, the blacksmith's wife, stepped closer to her own children with protective instincts that would have been appropriate for defending against dangerous wildlife. Her movement was subtle but unmistakable, suggesting that Margaret posed some kind of threat to innocent young minds. Indeed it is, Miss Porter replied with the measured tone of someone maintaining civility despite personal distaste. Though some mornings are better suited for private reflection than public socializing. The suggestion that Margaret should remove herself from public spaces was delivered with educational authority, as though Miss Porter were correcting a student's inappropriate behavior. It was the kind of subtle social pressure that had gradually isolated Margaret from normal community interactions. But today Margaret found herself responding differently to the implied criticism. Instead of feeling shame and retreating to her cabin, she experienced a curious sense of detachment from the judgment being delivered. These women's opinions seemed less important than they had just days earlier. I find that private reflection is enhanced by observing the natural world and human interactions. Margaret replied calmly. There's something instructive about watching how people treat one another, especially those they perceive as different or vulnerable. The response was mild in tone but sharp in content, suggesting that Margaret was studying the women's behavior with the same analytical attention they had been directing toward her moral failings. The implication that their treatment of her might itself be morally questionable was deeply unsettling. Mrs. Fletcher, whose husband had been Margaret's second spouse before departing for Oregon, flushed with anger at the implicit criticism. Some people bring their troubles on themselves through poor choices and moral failings. It's not the community's responsibility to pretend otherwise for the sake of misplaced charity. The attack was more direct than usual, motivated by Mrs. Fletcher's embarrassment at having her former son-in-law's failed marriage become public knowledge. She needed to establish clear moral distance between herself and Margaret's supposed failings. Margaret studied Mrs. Fletcher with new clarity, recognizing the fear beneath the woman's hostility. Mrs. Fletcher was terrified that association with Margaret's moral failures might somehow contaminate her own family's reputation. Her criticism was defensive rather than righteous, motivated by self-protection rather than genuine moral concern. Mrs. Fletcher, I'm sorry that Samuel's decision to seek opportunities elsewhere brought embarrassment to your family. But his choices were his own, just as mine are my own. Neither of us should be held responsible for decisions made by people we cannot control. The response acknowledged Mrs. Fletcher's pain while refusing to accept blame for circumstances beyond Margaret's influence. It was a demonstration of emotional maturity that caught the entire group off guard. Miss Porter sensed that the conversation was drifting away from the established narrative about Margaret's moral failings and moving toward uncomfortable questions about the community's treatment of vulnerable members. Such developments threatened the social order that depended on clear distinctions between the righteous and the fallen. Mrs. Thornfield, while we appreciate your perspective, some of us have responsibilities to protect impressionable minds from influences that might prove harmful. Perhaps this conversation would be better suited to a more private setting. The dismissal was delivered with educational authority, but Margaret recognized it as fear disguised as moral concern. Miss Porter was afraid that Margaret's growing assertiveness might influence other women to question the social structures that kept them dependent on male approval and community acceptance. Miss Porter, I agree that impressionable minds deserve protection, particularly from the idea that a woman's worth depends entirely on her ability to bear children or her success in keeping husbands alive despite disease and accident. The statement hung in the air like morning mist, visible to everyone present but difficult to grasp or respond to directly. Margaret had just challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying her persecution, suggesting that the community's moral standards were themselves morally questionable. Several of the women looked uncomfortable, recognizing truth in Margaret's observation even as their social conditioning demanded loyalty to established beliefs. The idea that a woman might have value beyond her biological functions was both appealing and terrifying. Mrs. Crenshaw gathered her children with urgent efficiency, as though Margaret's words were somehow contagious and might infect young minds with dangerous ideas about female independence. Her retreat was followed by two other mothers who seemed equally eager to escape the uncomfortable conversation. Miss Porter remained on the bridge, her face flushed with anger and something else. Perhaps recognition that Margaret's transformation posed a genuine threat to the social order that granted Miss Porter her own authority and influence. Mrs. Thornfield, I fear that recent events may have given you unrealistic expectations about your place in this community. Wealthy visitors sometimes make promises they have no intention of keeping, especially to women who lack the judgment to recognize empty flattery. The reference to Silas Moreland's visit was both warning and threat, suggesting that Margaret's growing confidence was based on false hopes that would inevitably lead to greater disappointment. It was an attempt to restore Margaret's sense of powerlessness by undermining her faith in the rancher's sincerity. Instead of feeling the intended anxiety, Margaret found herself analyzing Miss Porter's desperation with clinical detachment. The school teacher's authority depended on other women accepting their subordinate status without question. Margaret's growing independence threatened that entire system. Miss Porter, I appreciate your concern for my welfare. But I've learned to distinguish between genuine kindness and attempts to maintain social control disguised as helpful advice. The response was delivered with quiet confidence that left Miss Porter standing alone on the bridge, staring after Margaret's retreating figure with a mixture of rage and bewilderment. The Barren widow had just walked away from social authority with the calm assurance of someone who no longer needed community approval to validate her worth. Margaret's transformation accelerated as she made her way back toward her homestead. Each encounter had revealed another layer of the elaborate system designed to keep her feeling ashamed and powerless. But more importantly, each interaction had demonstrated that the system only worked when she participated in her own diminishment. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors to Margaret's cabin. Jonas Crenshaw, the town blacksmith, arrived with his teenage son David in a wagon loaded with tools and materials. Jonas was a man of few words who preferred the honest language of hammer and anvil to the complicated social interactions that governed Millbrook Valley's daily life. Mrs. Thornfield, Jonas said, removing his hat with the respectful gesture of someone who understood the value of honest work. Mr. Moreland stopped by my shop this morning, asked me to come out and take a look at your fence posts and gate hardware. Margaret studied the blacksmith's weathered features, searching for signs of the judgment she had learned to expect from townspeople. Instead, she saw the practical assessment of a craftsman evaluating a job that needed proper attention. I'm afraid I haven't commissioned any repair work, Mr. Crenshaw. There may have been some misunderstanding. Jonas shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling with social protocols that fell outside his area of expertise. Ma'am, Mr. Moreland said he'd settle the bill directly. Said your property deserved proper maintenance whether you could afford it or not. The gesture was both generous and somewhat presumptuous, suggesting that Silas Moreland was taking seriously his promise to provide support and protection. But it also raised questions about his expectations and the obligations such generosity might create. Young David Crenshaw had been examining the fence posts with the eager attention of someone learning his father's trade. His assessment was delivered with the honesty of youth, uncomplicated by adult social considerations. These posts are ready to fall over with the next strong wind. Gate hardware's rusted through. Be a danger to anyone trying to use it properly. Jonas nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose professional judgment had been confirmed by objective evidence. Boy's right. This fence is more decoration than protection. Needs proper attention if it's going to serve its purpose. Margaret found herself in the unusual position of receiving help without having to justify her worthiness or express appropriate gratitude for charity. Jonas Crenshaw was approaching the work as a professional obligation rather than moral mission, treating her like any other customer who deserved quality craftsmanship. Mr. Crenshaw, while I appreciate Mr. Moreland's generosity, I don't want to accept help that creates obligations I might not be able to fulfill. Jonas set down his tool bag and fixed Margaret with a stare that held the directness of someone comfortable with straightforward communication. Mrs. Thornfield, Mr. Moreland struck me as a man who says what he means and means what he says. Didn't mention anything about obligations or expectations. Just said your property needed attention and he was willing to pay for proper work. The blacksmith's assessment carried weight because it came from someone who dealt with practical realities rather than social complications. Jonas Crenshaw had built his reputation on delivering exactly what he promised, and he recognized similar qualities in others. David had begun unloading tools with the enthusiasm of someone eager to demonstrate newly acquired skills. His movement was efficient and purposeful, suggesting training in both craftsmanship and work ethic that would serve him well regardless of his eventual profession. "Ma'am, if you're worried about Mr. Moreland's motives, maybe you should ask him directly," David suggested with the uncomplicated logic of youth. "Seems like most problems come from folks assuming they know what other people are thinking instead of just asking straight questions." The observation was delivered without calculation or hidden agenda, making it particularly powerful in its simplicity. Margaret realized that she had been analyzing Silas Moreland's actions through the lens of her experience with other men rather than accepting them at face value. Jonas began examining the fence posts with professional thoroughness, testing their stability and noting areas requiring replacement or reinforcement. His movements were economical and purposeful, suggesting years of experience in assessing structural problems and developing effective solutions. "Mrs. Thornfield, would it be acceptable if we started with the gate hardware today? That's the most immediate safety concern. Rest of the work can wait if you need time to consider the arrangement." The offer respected Margaret's autonomy while addressing urgent practical needs. It was the kind of compromise that allowed her to accept help without feeling overwhelmed by obligations or expectations. "That would be acceptable, Mr. Crenshaw. Thank you for your consideration." As father and son began their work, Margaret found herself observing their interaction with unexpected pleasure. Jonas taught with patient demonstration rather than harsh criticism. David learned with eager attention rather than resentful obligation. Their partnership represented the kind of respectful collaboration she had rarely witnessed in Millbrook Valley. The afternoon's peaceful work was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Duncan Vale, who approached the cabin with the swagger of someone accustomed to having his authority acknowledged without question. Sheriff Vale wore his badge like a shield against criticism and his weapon like a symbol of unquestionable power. "Mrs. Thornfield," Sheriff Vale said, touching his hat brim with minimal courtesy. "Heard you've been having conversations around town that some folks find concerning." The accusation was vague enough to be difficult to challenge while specific enough to create anxiety about potential legal consequences. It was the kind of intimidation technique that Sheriff Vale had perfected through years of enforcing social order rather than actual law. Jonas Crenshaw looked up from his work with the mild interest of someone observing professional interaction outside his area of expertise. His presence provided a witness to whatever conversation might follow, potentially limiting Sheriff Vale's options for applying pressure. "Sheriff, I'm not aware of any conversations that would warrant legal attention. I've conducted business in town and spoken politely with community members. Nothing more." Margaret's response was calm and factual, offering no emotional ammunition for escalation while establishing her innocence of any actual wrongdoing. She had learned to navigate these encounters with careful precision. Sheriff Vale's eyes narrowed with frustration at her composed response. He seemed to prefer interactions with people who were either obviously guilty or obviously intimidated by his presence. Margaret's quiet confidence fell into neither category. "Mrs. Thornfield, there's been talk about outside influences affecting your behavior. Some folks are concerned that you might be getting ideas above your station." The warning was delivered with official authority, but Margaret recognized it as an attempt to re-establish social control through implied threat. Sheriff Vale was suggesting that her growing assertiveness was somehow inappropriate and potentially dangerous. Jonas Crenshaw continued his work with steady concentration, but Margaret noticed that his hammer strikes had become more forceful and deliberate. The blacksmith might not involve himself directly in social conflicts, but his body language suggested disapproval of Sheriff Vale's intimidation tactics. "Sheriff Vale, I'm conducting myself as a law-abiding citizen on my own property. If you have specific legal concerns, perhaps you could state them clearly rather than speaking in vague terms about talk and concerns." The request for specificity was a direct challenge to Sheriff Vale's preferred method of social control. He relied on implied threats and vague accusations that created anxiety without providing clear targets for response or defense. Mrs. Thornfield, you do well to remember that this community has ways of dealing with folks who forget their place. Wealth and influence don't change fundamental facts about character and moral standing. The threat was more direct than Sheriff Vale usually risked, but Margaret's transformation seemed to be provoking increasingly desperate attempts to restore the established social order. He needed her to return to her previous state of fearful submission. Instead, Margaret met his stare with steady composure that suggested his intimidation tactics were having the opposite of their intended effect. Sheriff, are you suggesting that law enforcement in Millbrook Valley is based on social status rather than actual legal violations? The question exposed the corruption underlying Sheriff Vale's authority, forcing him to either defend obvious injustice or retreat from his position. Either choice would damage his credibility and effectiveness. Sheriff Vale's face flushed with anger at being challenged so directly, but Jonas Crenshaw chose that moment to test the repaired gate hardware with a series of loud metallic clangs that emphasized the presence of witnesses to the conversation. "Work's going well, Mrs. Thornfield," Jonas said loudly enough to be heard by anyone in the vicinity. "This hardware should serve you properly for many years to come." Mr. Moreland was right about the importance of proper maintenance. The reference to Silas Moreland's involvement was both information and warning, reminding Sheriff Vale that Margaret now enjoyed the protection of someone with sufficient wealth and influence to challenge local authority if necessary. Sheriff Vale seemed to recognize that his intimidation tactics were no longer effective and might actually be counterproductive. His retreat was disguised as official business requiring his attention elsewhere. "Mrs. Thornfield, I trust you'll give serious consideration to the concerns I've expressed. Sometimes a friendly warning can prevent more serious difficulties." The parting threat was delivered with enough ambiguity to avoid direct confrontation while maintaining the atmosphere of implied danger that Sheriff Vale used to control community behavior. As the sheriff rode away, Jonas Crenshaw continued his work with the satisfied efficiency of someone who had contributed to justice without compromising his own position. His steady hammer strikes seemed to punctuate Margaret's growing understanding that resistance to oppression was not only possible but necessary. David looked up from organizing tools with the curiosity of youth observing adult complexities. "Mrs. Thornfield, why does the sheriff talk to you like you've done something wrong when you're just living peacefully on your own land?" The question was delivered with genuine confusion rather than calculated inquiry, making it particularly powerful in its simplicity. Young David Crenshaw had observed the interaction without the social conditioning that made adults accept injustice as normal. "That's an excellent question, David. Sometimes people use authority to maintain power rather than to ensure justice. It's important to understand the difference." Jonas nodded approvingly at Margaret's response, recognizing wisdom that would serve his son well in navigating future challenges. The blacksmith's approval carried weight because it came from someone who valued practical truth over social convention. As the Crenshaws completed their work and prepared to depart, Margaret found herself viewing her property with new eyes. The repaired gate hardware represented more than functional improvement. It symbolized the possibility that her life might actually be rebuilt on a foundation of respect and mutual support rather than charity and conditional tolerance. The setting sun painted Millbrook Valley in shades of gold and amber, but for the first time in 3 years Margaret felt the beauty rather than simply observing it with detached resignation. Silas Moreland's promise to give her 5 sons before winter still seemed impossible to fulfill, but his broader promise of respect and protection was already transforming her daily existence in ways she was only beginning to understand. The dawn mist clung to Mill Creek like secrets reluctant to be revealed. Margaret stood at her kitchen window watching the sun struggle through the gray veil that seemed to perpetually shroud Millbrook Valley. 3 days had passed since Silas Moreland's visit, and the town's reaction to their public conversation had been swift and predictable. Shopkeepers found sudden reasons to close early when she approached. Mothers gathered their children with exaggerated urgency when she walked past. Even the stray dogs that usually followed her for scraps now seemed wary of her presence. But something fundamental had shifted in Margaret's perception of these reactions. Where once she had felt the familiar stab of shame and isolation, now she experienced a curious detachment. The town's judgment seemed less like divine verdict and more like the desperate flailing of people protecting a narrative that served their own comfort rather than truth or justice. She had spent the sleepless hours before dawn reviewing every detail of her 3 marriages, examining them with the analytical clarity that Silas Moreland's words had somehow unlocked. Thomas Thornfield had been a good man weakened by consumption long before their wedding. His death from cholera had coincided with an outbreak that claimed 6 other lives in Millbrook Valley, but somehow only Margaret's loss was attributed to moral failing rather than medical tragedy. Samuel Fletcher had been kind but restless, a man who spoke often of California goldfields and Oregon timber opportunities. His departure for the Western Territories had followed a pattern established long before their marriage, but the town chose to interpret his abandonment as evidence of Margaret's inability to hold a husband's affection rather than recognition of Samuel's wandering nature. Henry Walsh had been a practical arrangement between 2 people seeking mutual benefit rather than romantic fulfillment. His drinking had escalated after his mother's death, and his fatal accident occurred during one of many solitary rides taken to escape the grief and guilt that consumed him. Yet Margaret bore responsibility for his self-destructive choices in the community's collective memory. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to examine it objectively. 3 men had faced challenges that existed independent of their relationship with Margaret Thornfield. Disease, restlessness, and alcohol had claimed their lives or driven their decisions. But attributing their fates to Margaret's supposed curse was more psychologically comfortable than acknowledging the random cruelty of existence or the personal responsibility each man bore for his own choices. Margaret's reflection was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Not the single rider she had grown accustomed to expecting, but multiple animals moving with the measured pace of a formal delegation. She recognized the rhythm immediately. Reverend Blackwell was returning with reinforcements. Through her window she watched the formation approach. Reverend Blackwell rode at the center, flanked by Mayor Whitmore and Banker Grimsby. Behind them came Dr. Hartwell and Sheriff Vale, followed by 3 men Margaret didn't immediately recognize. The formality of their arrangement suggested this was no casual social call but rather an official intervention designed to restore the social order that Margaret's transformation threatened to disrupt. Margaret smoothed her apron and checked her appearance in the small mirror beside her door. She would meet this delegation with the same quiet dignity that had sustained her through 3 years of persecution, but now that dignity was armored with new understanding of her own worth and the true nature of the accusations against her. Reverend Blackwell dismounted with the theatrical precision of someone accustomed to having his movements observed and interpreted as symbols of moral authority. His black coat was perfectly pressed despite the morning ride. His white collar gleamed like a badge of divine appointment. Everything about his appearance was calculated to remind observers of his position as spiritual leader and moral arbiter of Millbrook Valley. Mrs. Thornfield, he called in the resonant voice that commanded attention from his pulpit each Sunday morning. We've come to discuss matters of concern to the entire community. I trust you'll receive us with the courtesy that Christian fellowship demands. The phrasing was carefully chosen to put Margaret at an immediate disadvantage. Refusing to meet with them would appear uncharitable and defensive. Agreeing to the meeting would place her in the position of defendant answering charges rather than equal participant in discussion. It was the kind of subtle manipulation that Reverend Blackwell had perfected through years of pastoral counseling and community leadership. Margaret stepped onto her porch with measured composure, neither eager to engage nor obviously reluctant to face whatever accusations they might bring. Reverend Blackwell, gentlemen, you're welcome to state your business, though I confess some confusion about what community concerns might require such a formal delegation. Her response acknowledged their presence while subtly questioning the necessity of their numbers and the gravity they were attempting to attach to the situation. It was a demonstration of emotional intelligence that several of the men found surprisingly sophisticated. Mayor Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, clearly reluctant to participate in what he suspected might become an unpleasant confrontation. Ernest Whitmore had achieved his position through careful avoidance of controversial decisions rather than courageous leadership, and he recognized the potential for this encounter to damage his reputation regardless of its outcome. Mrs. Thornfield, Mayor Whitmore began with the diplomatic tone of someone attempting to minimize conflict while satisfying competing interests. We've received reports of conversations and behaviors that suggest outside influences may be affecting your judgment in ways that could prove harmful to community stability. The accusation was wrapped in language designed to sound official and reasonable while remaining vague enough to be difficult to challenge directly. Mayor Whitmore was attempting to criminalize Margaret's growing assertiveness without providing specific charges that might be disputed or defended against. Banker Grimsby chose this moment to assert his own authority in the proceedings. Harold Grimsby controlled credit and financing for most of Millbrook Valley's economic activity, granting him influence that often exceeded his actual position in the community's formal hierarchy. He wielded that influence with the calculated precision of someone who understood that economic dependence created social compliance. Mrs. Thornfield, your recent behavior suggests a concerning disregard for the financial and social realities of your situation, Grimsby declared with the authoritative tone of someone delivering objective assessment rather than personal opinion. Your mortgage remains in serious arrears, yet you've been observed engaging in activities and conversations that suggest unrealistic expectations about your future prospects. The criticism was designed to remind Margaret of her economic vulnerability while questioning her mental capacity to assess her own circumstances accurately. Grimsby was suggesting that her growing confidence was evidence of delusion rather than healthy self-respect. Dr. Hartwell urged his horse forward slightly, positioning himself where his medical authority would be most visible to Margaret and any potential observers. William Hartwell had cultivated his professional reputation through careful attention to social expectations as much as medical competence, and he recognized the importance of maintaining community confidence in his judgment. From a medical perspective, Dr. Hartwell announced with clinical precision, sudden changes in behavior and attitude can indicate underlying mental disturbances that require professional attention. Mrs. Thornfield's recent transformation may be symptomatic of hysteria or other feminine disorders that respond well to appropriate treatment and supervision. The diagnosis was delivered with scientific authority designed to medicalize Margaret's assertiveness and justify external control over her decisions and behavior. Dr. Hartwell was attempting to pathologize her refusal to accept social subordination, transforming resistance into illness requiring cure. Sheriff Vale remained silent but positioned himself where his weapon and badge were clearly visible. Duncan Vale understood that his presence served as implied threat rather than active participant in the conversation. His role was to remind Margaret that official authority backed whatever conclusions the delegation might reach about her situation and future. The three unfamiliar men introduced themselves with the formal courtesy of professionals conducting official business. They were representatives from the territorial government called to Millbrook Valley to investigate reports of unusual circumstances requiring administrative attention. Their presence elevated the proceedings from local social pressure to potential legal consequences. Mrs. Thornfield, the lead investigator, said with bureaucratic efficiency, "We've received communications suggesting that recent events in Millbrook Valley may require territorial oversight to ensure proper resolution of complex social and legal issues." Margaret recognized immediately that the territorial representatives had been summoned to provide external authority for whatever decisions the local leadership had already reached about her situation. They were not independent investigators seeking truth but rather official validation for predetermined conclusions. Reverend Blackwell stepped forward to assume his role as primary spokesman for the delegation. His position as spiritual leader granted him moral authority that the others lacked, making him the natural choice to articulate the community's concerns and proposed solutions. Mrs. Thornfield, for 3 years you have brought sorrow and misfortune to this community through circumstances that defy natural explanation. 3 husbands dead, your womb barren despite multiple marriages, crops failing in fields where you walk, children taking sick after your presence among them. The recitation was delivered with the rhythmic cadence of someone accustomed to public speaking, each accusation building upon the previous to create an overwhelming impression of supernatural malevolence. Reverend Blackwell was constructing a case for Margaret's removal from the community based on accumulated coincidence rather than actual evidence of wrongdoing. Your recent association with outsiders of questionable character has only amplified these concerns, he continued, his voice rising with righteous indignation. Moreland's wealth and influence cannot change the fundamental facts of your situation or absolve you of responsibility for the harm your presence brings to innocent people. The attack on Silas Moreland was calculated to isolate Margaret from her only source of protection and support. Reverend Blackwell was attempting to frame the rancher's intervention as misguided charity that enabled dangerous behavior rather than recognizing it as appropriate assistance to someone facing unjust persecution. Margaret listened to the accusations with the detached attention of someone observing a theatrical performance rather than facing personal attack. The charges were so absurd when stated explicitly that they revealed more about the accuser's psychology than about any actual threat she might pose to community welfare. Reverend Blackwell, she said when he paused for breath, you're suggesting that I somehow control disease, weather, and human behavior through supernatural means. These are serious accusations that would require extraordinary evidence to support. Her response was calm and analytical, treating the charges as hypotheses requiring proof rather than established facts demanding defense. It was a demonstration of intellectual sophistication that caught several of the men off guard. Dr. Hartwell attempted to provide scientific legitimacy for the supernatural accusations by reframing them in medical terms. Mrs. Thornfield, while we may not understand the precise mechanisms involved, statistical analysis suggests patterns that exceed normal probability ranges. Your presence correlates with increased mortality and morbidity rates in ways that medical science struggles to explain. The pseudo-scientific language was designed to make superstition sound scholarly while avoiding the need for actual data or rigorous analysis. Dr. Hartwell was using his medical credentials to legitimize conclusions that had no basis in scientific methodology. Margaret found herself responding with questions rather than defensive explanations. Dr. Hartwell, have you actually conducted statistical analysis comparing mortality rates during my residence to historical averages? Have you controlled for factors like population growth, seasonal variation, and economic conditions that might affect community health? The inquiry exposed the absence of actual scientific methodology behind Dr. Hartwell's impressive-sounding claims. He had been making authoritative statements based on impression and bias rather than rigorous investigation. Banker Grimsby attempted to redirect the conversation toward practical matters where his authority was more legitimate. Regardless of theoretical discussions about causation, Mrs. Thornfield faces immediate financial obligations that her current resources cannot satisfy. The community has shown remarkable patience with your situation, but charity cannot extend indefinitely. The shift to economic pressure was intended to move the discussion away from supernatural accusations that were difficult to prove toward financial facts that were undeniably accurate. Grimsby was suggesting that Margaret's poverty made her a burden regardless of any other considerations. Mr. Grimsby, my financial obligations are matters between me and my creditors. I'm not seeking charity from the community, nor have I requested assistance that would create burdens for others. Margaret's response acknowledged the reality of her economic situation while rejecting the implication that her poverty somehow justified the community's treatment of her or gave them authority over her personal decisions. The territorial investigator consulted a folder of papers with official efficiency designed to emphasize the government's interest in resolving the situation according to proper legal procedures. Mrs. Thornfield, territorial law provides mechanisms for addressing situations where individual circumstances create community instability or require administrative intervention. The reference to legal mechanisms was deliberately vague, designed to create anxiety about potential consequences without providing specific information that might be challenged or appealed. The investigator was using bureaucratic authority to support predetermined conclusions rather than conducting genuine investigation. Mayor Whitmore attempted to present the delegation's position as compassionate concern rather than punitive action. Mrs. Thornfield, we're prepared to offer assistance that would allow you to make a fresh start in circumstances more suitable to your situation. There are communities where your particular challenges might be better accommodated. The offer of relocation was presented as generous assistance while functioning as demand for voluntary exile. Mayor Whitmore was suggesting that Margaret's removal from Millbrook Valley would benefit everyone involved, including herself. Margaret recognized the ultimatum beneath the diplomatic language. The delegation was offering her the choice between voluntary departure and forced removal, but the outcome would be the same regardless of her response. They had already decided that her presence was incompatible with community welfare. Gentlemen, I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I'm curious about the legal authority that would support forcing a property owner to relocate based on accusations of supernatural influence over natural events. The question cut to the heart of their actual power to implement their demands. Margaret was challenging them to justify their authority rather than simply submitting to their collective pressure. Reverend Blackwell's face flushed with anger at her continued resistance to what he considered appropriate submission to moral and social authority. Mrs. Thornfield, your prideful refusal to acknowledge the harm your presence causes reveals the spiritual corruption that underlies these tragic circumstances. Humility and acceptance of God's will would serve you better than stubborn resistance to community wisdom. The accusation of pride was designed to transform Margaret's self-respect into moral failing, making her dignity appear as arrogance deserving punishment. Reverend Blackwell was using religious language to pathologize her refusal to accept social subordination. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the confrontation before Margaret could respond to the Reverend's accusations. A single rider was approaching at speed, his horse's hooves raising clouds of dust that announced his arrival long before his identity became clear. Silas Moreland appeared through the morning mist like a force of nature given human form. His massive frame seemed to dwarf even the powerful horse that carried him, but his approach was controlled rather than reckless. He assessed the situation with quick glances that took in the formal arrangement of riders, their positioning around Margaret's property, and the official nature of their gathering. He dismounted with fluid grace and approached the group with measured steps that suggested confidence rather than aggression. His presence immediately altered the dynamics of the confrontation, introducing an element that the delegation had hoped to avoid. "Gentlemen," Silas said with polite authority, touching his hat brim in acknowledgement of their positions while making no gesture of deference or submission. "Quite a gathering for such an early hour. I trust Mrs. Thornfield is receiving the courtesy that any property owner deserves from visitors to her land." His words were mild in tone but sharp in content, suggesting that he was prepared to evaluate their behavior according to standards of basic civility rather than accepting their authority to conduct official business on Margaret's property. Reverend Blackwell attempted to assert control over the situation by positioning himself as spokesman for legitimate community interests confronting outside interference. "Moreland, this is a matter of community concern that doesn't require input from recent arrivals who lack understanding of complex local circumstances." The dismissal was designed to establish Silas as an outsider whose opinions carried no weight in decisions affecting long-term residents. Reverend Blackwell was attempting to frame his intervention as inappropriate meddling rather than legitimate assistance to someone facing unjust treatment. Silas studied the Reverend with the patient attention of someone evaluating a potential business partner's character and reliability. His assessment was thorough and unhurried, suggesting that he reached conclusions based on observation rather than assumption. "Reverend, I've found that complex local circumstances often become much simpler when examined by someone without investment in maintaining existing power structures. Sometimes fresh perspective reveals solutions that weren't apparent to folks too close to the problem." The response was diplomatically phrased but unmistakably challenging, suggesting that the community's leadership might be part of the problem rather than qualified to implement solutions. Silas was questioning their competence and motives without direct confrontation. Dr. Hartwell attempted to provide medical authority for the delegation's position by presenting Margaret's situation as requiring professional intervention rather than outside interference. "Mr. Moreland, Mrs. Thornfield's recent behavioral changes suggest underlying mental disturbances that require appropriate medical supervision. Your well-intentioned but misguided support may be enabling dangerous delusions." The medical diagnosis was intended to discredit both Margaret's assertiveness and Silas's support, transforming their alliance into evidence of shared mental instability requiring external control. Silas turned his full attention to Dr. Hartwell with interest that seemed genuine rather than hostile. Doctor, that's a fascinating diagnosis. I'd be curious to hear about the specific symptoms and examination procedures that led to such definitive conclusions about Mrs. Thornfield's mental state. The inquiry was delivered with respectful interest in Dr. Hartwell's professional expertise, but it required him to provide actual evidence for conclusions that were based on social prejudice rather than medical assessment. Dr. Hartwell found himself in the uncomfortable position of defending medical conclusions that had no basis in actual examination or scientific methodology. Mr. Moreland, certain patterns of behavior are recognizable to trained medical professionals even without formal examination. Mrs. Thornfield's sudden transformation from appropriate humility to inappropriate assertiveness suggests underlying hysteria or related feminine disorders. The explanation revealed the absence of actual medical basis for Dr. Hartwell's diagnosis, while demonstrating his reliance on social expectations rather than scientific criteria for determining mental health. Sheriff Vale finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his words accepted without question. Mr. Moreland, this is official business conducted under proper legal authority. Your presence here constitutes interference with legitimate government proceedings. The assertion of legal authority was designed to criminalize Silas's support for Margaret while establishing Sheriff Vale's power to control the situation through force if necessary. Silas examined Sheriff Vale with the same careful attention he had directed toward the other members of the delegation. His assessment was thorough and patient, suggesting that he was evaluating the sheriff's actual authority rather than simply accepting his claims at face value. Sheriff, I'd be interested to see the legal documents that establish your authority to conduct official proceedings on private property without the owner's consent. As a property owner myself, I try to stay informed about territorial law regarding such matters. The request for documentation exposed the absence of actual legal authority behind Sheriff Vale's impressive claims. He was relying on intimidation and assumption rather than legitimate governmental power. The territorial investigator attempted to provide the legal legitimacy that Sheriff Vale lacked by producing official papers from his folder. Mr. Moreland, territorial law grants investigative authority in cases involving potential threats to community welfare or violations of public order. The documents appeared impressive and official, but Silas examined them with the careful attention of someone familiar with legal procedures and governmental authority. These documents authorize investigation of reported violations, Silas observed after reading them thoroughly. They don't authorize predetermined conclusions or punishment without due process. Have formal charges been filed against Mrs. Thornfield, or is this investigation still in the fact-gathering stage? The distinction between investigation and judgment was crucial, and Silas's question exposed the delegation's attempt to skip proper legal procedures in favor of immediate action based on social pressure rather than evidence. Mayor Whitmore attempted to de-escalate the situation by presenting their actions as compassionate assistance rather than legal proceedings. Mr. Moreland, we're simply trying to help Mrs. Thornfield understand her options for resolving a difficult situation that benefits no one in its current form. The diplomatic language was designed to make their ultimatum appear reasonable while avoiding direct confrontation with Silas's obvious willingness to challenge their authority. Margaret had remained silent during the exchange, observing how Silas's presence changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. The delegation's confidence had evaporated when faced with someone who possessed both the resources and the knowledge to challenge their authority effectively. Gentlemen, Margaret said when the various accusations and justifications had been exhausted, I appreciate your concern for my welfare and the community's stability. However, I'm comfortable with my current circumstances and see no reason to make changes based on speculation about supernatural influence or medical conditions that have never been properly diagnosed. Her response was calm and definitive, rejecting their authority over her decisions while maintaining the courtesy that made direct retaliation difficult to justify. Reverend Blackwell's face darkened with rage at her continued resistance to what he considered appropriate submission to legitimate authority. Mrs. Thornfield, your stubborn refusal to acknowledge reality will only bring greater suffering to yourself and others. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. The biblical quotation was delivered with the authority of divine pronouncement, suggesting that Margaret's resistance would inevitably result in punishment from higher powers than human authority. Silas stepped closer to Margaret, his movement subtle but unmistakable in its protective intent. Reverend, seems to me that pride and haughty spirit are demonstrated more by those who claim authority over others' lives than by folks simply trying to live peacefully on their own property. The observation reversed the moral criticism, suggesting that the delegation's behavior revealed more pride and spiritual corruption than Margaret's refusal to submit to their demands. The confrontation had reached an impasse where neither side could achieve their objectives without escalating to direct conflict that might have unpredictable consequences. The delegation had failed to intimidate Margaret into voluntary compliance, while Silas's intervention had neutralized their ability to apply effective pressure. Banker Grimsby attempted one final appeal to practical considerations that might persuade Margaret to accept their assistance. Mrs. Thornfield, financial realities cannot be ignored indefinitely. Your current obligations exceed your resources, and without realistic solutions, foreclosure becomes inevitable regardless of other considerations. The reminder of her economic vulnerability was accurate but incomplete. Failing to acknowledge Silas's obvious willingness to provide financial support if necessary. Mr. Grimsby, Silas said with quiet authority, what would be the exact amount required to satisfy Mrs. Thornfield's outstanding obligations and ensure her property rights remain secure? The question transformed the financial pressure from insurmountable obstacle to negotiable detail, demonstrating Silas's resources and willingness to use them in Margaret's defense. The delegation recognized that their carefully constructed pressure campaign had collapsed in the face of determined resistance backed by adequate resources. Their authority depended on Margaret's isolation and vulnerability, both of which had been eliminated by Silas's intervention. As the territorial representatives prepared to depart, they issued final warnings about the consequences of interfering with legitimate government proceedings and the importance of resolving community problems through proper channels. Their retreat was disguised as official business requiring attention elsewhere, but the defeat was obvious to everyone present. Margaret watched the delegation ride away with mixed emotions. Relief at having survived another attempt to force her submission was tempered by recognition that the conflict was far from resolved. The men who had just departed would not accept this defeat as final, but would instead search for new strategies to achieve their objectives. Silas remained beside her as the dust settled, his presence a continuing reminder that she no longer faced these challenges alone. His promise to give her 5 sons before winter still seemed impossible to fulfill, but his broader commitment to protection and respect was already transforming her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. The weeks following the delegation's failed intervention brought an uneasy peace to Millbrook Valley. Margaret had noticed subtle changes in how townspeople regarded her since Silas Moreland's public support had neutralized their collective pressure. Where once she faced open hostility, now she encountered careful neutrality. Shopkeepers served her without warmth, but also without the deliberate rudeness that had characterized their previous interactions. Children no longer scattered when she approached, though their mothers still watched with guarded expressions. But Margaret had learned to recognize the difference between genuine acceptance and strategic withdrawal. The town's leadership had not abandoned their campaign against her. They had simply retreated to develop new tactics that might prove more effective than direct confrontation. She could feel their watchful attention like pressure before a storm, building toward some inevitable clash that would determine her future in Millbrook Valley once and for all. Silas had become a regular presence at her homestead, arriving each morning to assist with repairs and improvements that transformed her modest property into something approaching prosperity. His work was methodical and purposeful, addressing practical needs while demonstrating his commitment to her welfare in ways that made reversal increasingly difficult for anyone hoping to drive her away. He had proven surprisingly skilled at domestic tasks that most men considered beneath their dignity. His massive hands could mend delicate fabric with the same precision they applied to heavy construction work. His knowledge of farming extended beyond cattle ranching to include vegetable cultivation and soil management that improved her garden's productivity beyond anything she had achieved alone. Most remarkably,
Silas had begun teaching Margaret skills that expanded her independence rather than increasing her dependence on his support. He showed her how to manage financial records with the systematic attention that prevented the kind of exploitation she had suffered from previous creditors. He explained legal procedures that protected property rights and personal autonomy. He shared knowledge accumulated through years of navigating complex business relationships and territorial politics. Independence isn't just about surviving alone, he explained one afternoon while demonstrating proper techniques for maintaining farm equipment. It's about understanding systems well enough that nobody can use your ignorance against you. Margaret had discovered an appetite for learning that surprised both of them. Her intelligence, suppressed for years by circumstances that demanded mere survival, flourished when given proper direction and encouragement. She absorbed information about law, business, and practical skills with the enthusiasm of someone finally allowed to develop her full capabilities. But their growing partnership had not escaped the attention of those who viewed Margaret's transformation as a threat to established social order. Reverend Blackwell had begun delivering sermons that spoke pointedly about the dangers of pride and the importance of accepting God's will for one's station in life. His messages were carefully crafted to avoid direct accusations while making his disapproval unmistakably clear to anyone familiar with local circumstances. Hartwell had started visiting neighboring homesteads more frequently, ostensibly to check on community health, but actually to spread concerns about the psychological dangers of sudden personality changes and the medical risks associated with feminine hysteria. His professional authority lent credibility to warnings that might otherwise be dismissed as mere gossip. Sheriff Vale had increased his patrols through the area around Margaret's property, creating an atmosphere of official surveillance that suggested ongoing investigation of potential criminal activity. His presence served as constant reminder that legal authority remained hostile to her interests despite the temporary setback represented by Silas's intervention. The pressure campaign reached its culmination on a crisp October morning when Margaret discovered 5 young boys huddled in her barn, seeking shelter from a sudden autumn storm. They were dirty, frightened, and obviously hungry, with clothing that suggested recent hard travel and circumstances that had left them without proper care or supervision. The oldest boy, perhaps 12 years of age, stepped forward with the protective stance of someone accustomed to responsibility beyond his years. His name was Timothy, and he spoke for the
Group with carefully measured words that revealed intelligence constrained by desperate circumstances. "Ma'am, we didn't mean to trespass on your property," Timothy said with formal politeness that seemed learned rather than natural. "We were seeking shelter from the storm and will move along as soon as the weather clears." Margaret studied the 5 boys with growing concern for their obvious distress and uncertainty about their origins or destinations. They ranged in age from perhaps 8 to 13, all showing signs of recent hardship but maintaining dignity that spoke to their underlying character despite their current circumstances. "Boys, you're welcome to shelter here as long as necessary," she said, her voice carrying the warmth that had been suppressed for years but was gradually returning as her confidence grew. "But I'd like to understand how you came to be traveling alone in weather like this." Timothy exchanged glances with his companions before responding with the careful honesty of someone who had learned that truth was usually safer than deception, even when truth revealed vulnerability. "Ma'am, we're orphans from the Territorial Children's Home in Deadwood. The administrator told us we were being transferred to families who had requested boys for adoption, but when we arrived in Millbrook Valley yesterday, nobody was expecting us." The explanation revealed a situation that was both heartbreaking and suspicious. 5 orphaned boys had been transported to a community where no legitimate adoptive families awaited them, leaving them stranded without resources or protection in an unfamiliar environment. Margaret felt anger building in her chest as she recognized the pattern of manipulation that had characterized her own persecution in Millbrook Valley. Someone had arranged for these vulnerable children to be delivered to a situation designed to create crisis and opportunity for those prepared to exploit it. "Timothy, did the administrator give you any documentation about your placement or the families who were supposed to receive you?" The boy produced a crumpled envelope from his coat pocket containing official papers that Margaret examined with the analytical skills that Silas had been teaching her. The documents appeared legitimate at first glance, but closer inspection revealed inconsistencies that suggested deliberate deception. The supposed adoptive families were identified by names that didn't correspond to any current residents of Millbrook Valley. The authorizing signatures belonged to officials whose authority to arrange such placements was questionable at best. Most tellingly, the transportation arrangements had been paid for by a benefactor whose identity was carefully obscured behind layers of bureaucratic language. Margaret recognized immediately that the boys' arrival was not coincidental but rather the latest move in the ongoing campaign against her independence and security. Someone had arranged for 5 desperate children to appear at precisely the moment when their need for shelter and care would create maximum pressure on her resources and decision-making. The cruel brilliance of the strategy was obvious once she understood its purpose. Taking in the boys would demonstrate her maternal instincts while stretching her limited resources beyond sustainability. Turning them away would provide evidence of the hard-heartedness that her critics claimed characterized women who refused their proper role in society. But Margaret had learned enough about manipulation to recognize when it was being applied against her, and her response surprised even herself with its clarity and determination. "Boys, you're welcome to stay here as long as necessary while we sort out this situation properly," she announced with authority that brooked no argument. "But first, we need to understand exactly who arranged your transportation and why they sent you to a place where no families were prepared to receive you." Her decision to investigate rather than simply react demonstrated the transformation that months of Silas's support and education had accomplished. Instead of being overwhelmed by crisis, she was analyzing its components and developing strategies to address both immediate needs and underlying causes. Timothy's relief at finding acceptance rather than rejection was visible in the relaxation of his shoulders and the first genuine smile Margaret had seen from him. "Ma'am, we'd be grateful for any help you can provide. We've been taking care of each other since our parents died, but traveling alone has been harder than we expected." The other boys gathered closer as Margaret invited them into her cabin for food and warmth. Their names were Samuel, David, Benjamin, and little Jacob, each carrying his own story of loss and resilience that had brought them to this moment of desperate need. As Margaret prepared soup and bread for her unexpected guests, she found herself thinking about Silas's promise to give her 5 sons before winter. The rancher's words had seemed impossible when first spoken, but the arrival of these 5 orphaned boys suggested possibilities she had never considered. Perhaps Silas had somehow arranged their placement, using his knowledge of territorial politics and bureaucratic procedures to bring children who needed care to a woman who needed purpose. Perhaps his promise had been less about biological transformation and more about creating the family relationships that legal adoption could accomplish as effectively as natural birth. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her speculation, bringing the familiar tension that had become associated with unwelcome visitors bearing ultimatums disguised as social concern. Through her window she saw Reverend Blackwell arriving with his usual entourage, but this time their formation included additional riders whose official appearance suggested territorial authority. Margaret recognized immediately that the boys' arrival had triggered exactly the response their placement was designed to provoke. The community's leadership had been waiting for circumstances that would justify decisive intervention, and 5 orphaned children dependent on the Barren widow's questionable care provided the perfect pretext for action they had long desired to take. "Timothy," she said quietly, her voice carrying calm authority rather than panic or uncertainty, "I want you and the other boys to remain inside while I speak with these visitors. Whatever you hear, don't come outside unless I specifically call for you." The boy nodded with understanding that suggested familiarity with adult conflicts that could affect children's welfare. He gathered his companions toward the back of the cabin, positioning them where they could hear what transpired but remain out of direct sight. Margaret stepped onto her porch with the same quiet dignity that had sustained her through countless previous confrontations. But now that dignity was supported by months of growing confidence and understanding of her own rights and capabilities. Reverend Blackwell dismounted with theatrical precision, his black coat billowing dramatically in the autumn wind. His pale eyes fixed on Margaret with the intensity of someone delivering divine judgment rather than engaging in ordinary human conversation. "Mrs. Thornfield," he announced in the resonant voice that commanded attention from his pulpit, We've received reports of concerning developments that require immediate attention from proper authorities. Behind him, the territorial representatives prepared their own dismount with bureaucratic efficiency that suggested official business conducted according to established procedures. Their presence elevated the confrontation beyond local social pressure to potential legal consequences that could fundamentally alter Margaret's circumstances. Dr. Hartwell urged his horse forward, positioning himself where his medical authority would be most visible and influential. Mrs. Thornfield, caring for multiple children requires resources and capabilities that exceed what any single woman can provide, especially one with a history of mental instability and questionable judgment. The medical assessment was delivered with professional authority designed to transform Margaret's kindness toward desperate children into evidence of dangerous delusion requiring external intervention and control. Sheriff Vale remained mounted but positioned himself where his weapon and badge were clearly visible, serving as implied threat that official authority backed whatever conclusions the delegation might reach about the situation's appropriate resolution. Mayor Whitmore attempted to present their intervention as compassionate concern rather than punitive action. Mrs. Thornfield, 5 children represent a considerable responsibility that requires proper planning and community support. We're prepared to assist in arranging appropriate care through established channels. The offer of assistance was phrased diplomatically while functioning as demand for surrender of the boys to officials who would determine their placement according to criteria that might not prioritize their actual welfare. Margaret listened to the familiar pattern of accusations and justifications with the analytical attention of someone who had learned to recognize manipulation disguised as legitimate authority. These men were using the children's vulnerability to advance their own agenda while claiming to act in everyone's best interests. Gentlemen, she replied with calm certainty. These boys sought shelter from a storm, and I provided it. Their welfare is my primary concern, but I'm curious about the circumstances that brought them to Millbrook Valley without proper arrangements for their care. Her response shifted attention from her supposed inadequacy as caregiver to the suspicious circumstances surrounding the boys' arrival, forcing the delegation to address questions they had hoped to avoid. The territorial investigator consulted his papers with official efficiency designed to emphasize governmental authority over private decisions affecting children's welfare. Mrs. Thornfield, territorial law grants specific powers regarding the placement and supervision of orphan children. These boys require care through proper legal channels rather than informal arrangements with unqualified individuals. The assertion of legal authority was designed to criminalize Margaret's assistance while establishing governmental power to remove the children according to procedures that she could not challenge or influence. Before Margaret could respond to these accusations, the sound of rapidly approaching hoofbeats announced another arrival that would fundamentally alter the confrontation's dynamics. Silas Moreland appeared through the morning mist with the controlled urgency of someone responding to crisis while maintaining strategic advantage. But Silas was not alone. Behind him rode a man whose presence immediately commanded attention from everyone present. Judge Morrison wore the formal attire of territorial judicial authority, and his bearing suggested someone accustomed to making decisions that others were obligated to respect and implement. Silas dismounted with fluid grace and approached the group with measured steps that suggested confidence rather than aggression. His massive frame seemed to anchor the proceedings, providing stability in what had threatened to become chaotic confrontation. "Gentlemen," Silas said with polite authority, "Judge Morrison has traveled from the territorial capital to address concerns about irregular placement procedures for orphan children. His Honor has some questions about the documentation and authorization that brought these boys to Millbrook Valley." The judge's presence transformed the confrontation from local pressure campaign to formal legal proceeding with real consequences for anyone found to have violated territorial law regarding children's welfare and placement procedures. Judge Morrison examined the delegation with judicial attention that seemed to assess each man's credibility and potential involvement in whatever irregularities had occurred. His evaluation was thorough and patient, suggesting conclusions based on evidence rather than assumption. "Reverend Blackwell," Judge Morrison said with formal courtesy, "I understand you've taken considerable interest in these children's placement. I'd be curious to hear about your knowledge of the arrangements that brought them to this community."
The inquiry was delivered with respectful attention to the Reverend's position while requiring him to provide specific information about his involvement in circumstances that were increasingly appearing suspicious rather than legitimate. Reverend Blackwell's face flushed with anger at being questioned by someone whose authority exceeded his own moral leadership of the community. Your Honor, my concern is entirely for the children's welfare and the community's stability. Mrs. Thornfield lacks the resources and moral character necessary for proper child rearing. The accusation was delivered with religious authority, but Judge Morrison's expression suggested skepticism about moral judgments presented as legal evidence. Reverend, I'm more interested in documented facts than personal opinions about character. Do you have specific knowledge about who arranged these children's transportation and why they were sent to families that don't appear to exist? The question cut to the heart of the irregularities that had brought the boys to Margaret's doorstep, requiring specific answers about administrative procedures rather than allowing continued focus on her supposed inadequacies. Dr. Hartwell attempted to provide medical legitimacy for concerns about Margaret's fitness as caregiver. Your Honor, from a professional perspective, Mrs. Thornfield has demonstrated behavioral patterns consistent with mental instability that could pose risks to children's welfare. Judge Morrison turned his full attention to Dr. Hartwell with interest that seemed genuine rather than hostile. Doctor, I'd like to review your medical records and examination notes that support this diagnosis. When did you last conduct a formal mental health assessment of Mrs. Thornfield? The request for documentation exposed the absence of actual medical basis for Dr. Hartwell's impressive-sounding claims about Margaret's mental state and fitness for responsibility. The territorial investigator attempted to redirect attention toward bureaucratic authority that might justify the delegation's intervention. Your Honor, our investigation suggests irregular circumstances that require administrative resolution through proper governmental channels. Judge Morrison examined the investigator's documents with careful attention to detail that suggested familiarity with proper legal procedures and administrative requirements. These papers authorize investigation of reported violations, the judge observed after thorough review. They don't authorize predetermined conclusions or actions without due process. Have formal charges been filed against Mrs. Thornfield, or are we still in the fact-gathering stage of this investigation? The distinction between investigation and judgment was crucial, and the judge's question exposed the delegation's attempt to skip proper legal procedures in favor of immediate action based on social pressure rather than evidence. Sheriff Vale finally spoke, his voice carrying authority that had rarely been challenged in Millbrook Valley. Your Honor, this is a local matter that doesn't require territorial intervention. We're fully capable of handling our own community problems. Judge Morrison studied Sheriff Vale with judicial attention that seemed to assess his competence and integrity as well as his authority to make such claims. Sheriff, territorial law supersedes local authority in matters involving children's welfare and potential violations of adoption procedures. I'm here to ensure that proper legal standards are maintained regardless of local preferences. The assertion of higher legal authority neutralized Sheriff Vale's ability to control the situation through intimidation or claims of local jurisdiction. Margaret had remained silent during this exchange, observing how Judge Morrison's presence fundamentally altered the power dynamics that had governed her persecution for months. The community leaders who had seemed so formidable when facing her alone appeared uncertain and defensive when required to justify their actions to legitimate legal authority. Your Honor, Margaret said when the various accusations and justifications had been exhausted, I'm primarily concerned with these children's immediate welfare and long-term security. If there are legal procedures that would formalize my ability to provide proper care, I'm willing to pursue them through appropriate channels. Her response demonstrated both practical wisdom and legal sophistication that impressed Judge Morrison while revealing the inadequacy of accusations about her mental instability or poor judgment. Silas stepped forward with documents that he produced from his coat pocket. Your Honor, I've prepared formal adoption petitions for all 5 boys, with Mrs. Thornfield and myself as joint petitioners. Our legal counsel has reviewed territorial requirements and believes these arrangements would serve the children's best interests. The revelation that formal legal procedures had been anticipated and prepared stunned the delegation into momentary silence. Their carefully constructed pressure campaign had been neutralized by proper legal planning that addressed the children's needs while protecting Margaret's rights. Judge Morrison examined the adoption papers with professional attention to legal requirements and procedural correctness. His review was thorough and unhurried, suggesting conclusions based on legal standards rather than social prejudice. These petitions appear complete and properly prepared. The judge announced after careful examination. I'll need to interview the children individually to ensure their consent and welfare, but the documentation meets territorial requirements for adoption proceedings. The legal validation of Margaret and Silas's intentions transformed the entire situation from crisis requiring intervention to legitimate family formation deserving protection and support. Timothy chose that moment to emerge from the cabin, followed by his 4 companions who had been listening to the proceedings with growing hope that they might finally find permanent homes and security. Your Honor, Timothy said with the formal politeness that had impressed Margaret, we understand you need to speak with each of us about our wishes for placement and care. Judge Morrison's expression softened as he observed the boys' obvious intelligence and dignity despite their difficult circumstances. His attention to their welfare appeared genuine rather than bureaucratic, suggesting commitment to their actual interests rather than abstract legal requirements. Over the following hour, Judge Morrison conducted private interviews with each boy, assessing their understanding of the situation and their preferences for future placement. Their responses were unanimous in supporting adoption by Margaret and Silas, whom they viewed as offering the security and affection they had been seeking since losing their original families. The delegation's campaign collapsed as legitimate legal authority validated what they had attempted to present as dangerous delusion. Margaret's kindness toward desperate children was revealed as appropriate Christian charity rather than evidence of mental instability. Silas's support was demonstrated to be legitimate assistance rather than exploitation of vulnerable circumstances. Reverend Blackwell made one final attempt to salvage his authority by appealing to religious concerns about unconventional family. Your Honor, these proposed adoptions violate traditional Christian values about proper family structure and moral authority. Judge Morrison studied the Reverend with judicial patience that seemed designed to allow him sufficient opportunity to damage his own credibility through continued objections. Reverend, territorial law recognizes adoption by qualified individuals regardless of their marital status, especially when children's welfare is at stake. I see nothing in these arrangements that violates legal requirements or genuine Christian charity. The legal and moral validation of Margaret and Silas's intentions effectively ended organized opposition to their plans while establishing precedent that would protect similar arrangements in the future. As the delegation prepared their reluctant departure, Banker Grimsby attempted one final appeal to practical considerations that might undermine the adoption proceedings. Your Honor, these arrangements require considerable financial resources that may exceed the petitioner's actual capabilities. Silas produced additional documents that detailed his assets and income with the precision of someone prepared for exactly this challenge. Grimsby, I believe you'll find our financial resources more than adequate for supporting 5 additional family members in appropriate comfort and security. The financial documentation eliminated the last potential objection to the adoptions while demonstrating Silas's thorough preparation for every aspect of the legal proceedings. Judge Morrison concluded the formal proceedings by scheduling final hearings for the following week, allowing time for any additional legal requirements to be satisfied while ensuring that the children's placement would be completed according to proper territorial procedures. As the various officials and objectors departed, Margaret found herself standing in her yard, surrounded by 5 boys who were already beginning to look at her and Silas with the hopeful affection of children who believed they had finally found permanent homes and genuine family relationships. I'll give you 5 sons before winter, Silas had promised, and the approach of November made his words seem prophetic rather than impossible. The boys' arrival had provided the family relationships that Margaret had thought forever beyond her reach, while demonstrating Silas's commitment to promises that seemed too good to believe when first spoken. The weeks that followed brought the transformation of Margaret's modest homestead into something approaching a thriving family farm. 5 energetic boys required considerable resources and attention, but they also provided labor and enthusiasm that enhanced productivity beyond what she and Silas could have achieved alone. Timothy proved skilled at managing livestock and younger children with equal competence. Samuel demonstrated natural ability with mechanical repairs and construction projects. David showed aptitude for academic learning that suggested potential for education beyond what Millbrook Valley could provide. Benjamin possessed artistic talents that brought beauty and creativity to their daily routines. Little Jacob contributed energy and affection that reminded everyone of the importance of play and laughter in family life. Margaret discovered that motherhood came naturally to her despite years of believing herself fundamentally defective in maternal instincts. Her intelligence and organizational skills translated effectively into managing household complexity while ensuring that each boy received individual attention and guidance appropriate to his particular needs and talents. Silas revealed unexpected aptitude for fatherhood, combining gentle authority with patient instruction that helped the boys develop confidence and capabilities rather than simple obedience. His massive frame seemed designed for providing the security that children needed, while his quiet wisdom offered guidance for navigating challenges that their difficult backgrounds had not prepared them to handle alone. The formal adoption proceedings concluded without opposition, establishing legal relationships that would protect the boys' security while creating the family bonds that had brought meaning and purpose to Margaret's life beyond anything she had previously experienced. Millbrook Valley gradually adjusted to the reality of Margaret's transformation from persecuted widow to respected mother and community member. The town's leadership maintained careful distance from direct conflict while acknowledging that their campaign against her had failed completely and permanently. Reverend Blackwell continued delivering sermons about pride and moral authority, but his congregation seemed less responsive to messages that had been revealed as personal prejudice rather than divine guidance. His influence diminished as people recognized the difference between genuine spiritual leadership and social control disguised as religious authority. Dr. Hartwell resumed normal medical practice while avoiding further commentary about mental health issues beyond his actual expertise. His professional reputation recovered as he focused on legitimate medical care rather than pseudo-scientific validation of social prejudices. Sheriff Vale maintained law and order according to actual legal requirements rather than personal preferences about appropriate social arrangements. His authority became more legitimate as it became less arbitrary and discriminatory. The success of Margaret and Silas's unconventional family demonstrated possibilities that other community members began to consider for addressing their own challenges and aspirations. Adoption of orphan children increased as families recognized the mutual benefits of providing homes for young people who needed security while contributing energy and purpose to adult lives. Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow that blanketed Millbrook Valley in pristine white that seemed to symbolize the fresh beginning that Margaret's life had become. The cabin that had once echoed with lonely emptiness now rang with voices and laughter that made even the coldest evenings feel warm and welcoming. Margaret stood at her kitchen window on Christmas morning, watching 5 boys playing in the snow with the uninhibited joy of children who knew they were loved and secure. Their laughter carried across the frozen landscape like music that celebrated not just the holiday but the miracle of family relationships that had seemed impossible just months earlier. Silas emerged from the barn carrying firewood that would keep their home warm through the long winter nights ahead. His promise to give her 5 sons before winter had been fulfilled in ways that neither of them could have anticipated when first spoken. But the deeper promise of respect and partnership had proven even more valuable than the specific blessing of motherhood. The barren widow had become a devoted mother. The mysterious rancher had revealed himself as a wise and caring father. Together they had created something more valuable than either could have achieved alone. A family built on mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared commitment to nurturing the next generation of citizens who would carry forward the lessons learned about courage, dignity, and the power of truth to overcome prejudice and fear. Margaret's transformation was complete, but it was also beginning. The confidence and capabilities she had developed through months of challenge and growth would serve her well in the years ahead, as she guided 5 boys toward adulthood while contributing to her community's continued development toward greater justice and compassion. The promise had been kept, the curse had been broken, and winter brought not ending but beginning of the life that Margaret had always deserved but had never dared to believe possible, until Silas Moreland showed her that some promises, however impossible they might seem, are worth keeping no matter what obstacles stand in the way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.